step into the shadows of the unknown. Have you ever felt a chill crawl up your spine as you lay in the dark, wondering if you are truly alone? Do your deepest fears whisper to you when the night grows silent? This video is for those who crave the thrill of horror, who find comfort in the unsettling, and who seek stories that linger in the mind long after the screen goes dark. Each tale will pull you deeper into a world of dread, uncertainty, and terror, where reality bends and nightmares come to life. But amidst the fear, there's a strange satisfaction, a rush of adrenaline, the kind of exhilaration that only true horror can bring. Dare to listen, and let the darkness consume you. Get ready for the spine-chilling tale I'm about to unfold. I'm not sure if this is the right platform for such a story, but I can't think of anywhere else to share it, and I really need to get it off my chest. I've already shared this with everyone I know, my family, neighbors, friends, even random news outlets. It's just never enough. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I feel this strange compulsion to let as many people as possible know what's been going on in my life. So here it goes. As I write this, it's November 2019. This saga dates back quite a while, over 7 years to be precise. I can't pinpoint the exact year right now, but let's say it was around 2012. It could have been 2013, but that's my best estimate. Back then, I was in my mid-20s, happily employed and in a relationship with my girlfriend, who is now my fiancée. I hadn't attended college, so I had been working for some time, and it seemed unlikely that my life would take any dramatic turns. Because of that, I saw no reason to move far from home, so I stayed put. At that point in our lives, my girlfriend and I had just settled into my childhood home, which my parents generously passed down to me as my first residence. It's an incredibly old brick house that my dad inherited from his parents when he was about 40, so it's remaining in the family. The house has undergone several renovations over the years, yet its age is still evident. The brick exterior gives away its history. There aren't many brick houses in our neighborhood, making it stand out quite a bit. I actually appreciate that uniqueness. It adds a special charm. Speaking of our neighborhood, it's quite wooded, which means the homes are spaced out nicely. Our house happens to be the last one on our street, so instead of having woods on just one side, we're flanked by them on 2 sides. The forest behind us is enormous, truly massive. When I was a child, my brothers and I would frequently venture into the woods, but no matter how much we roamed around, we never came close to mapping it all out. While some might find that daunting, I've always had a fondness for nature, so it didn't bother me at all. Additionally, I've always been someone who enjoys solitude, so being tucked away in my own little slice of the world was quite appealing. Fast forward a bit, my girlfriend and I had settled into our home there for a few months when strange events began to unfold. It was during winter. Though I can't recall the specific month, I distinctly remember the snow covering the ground. It was a Sunday morning, shortly after 8 a.m., which is the one day I allowed myself to sleep in. As I was about to hop into my pickup truck for my usual Sunday coffee run, I noticed something peculiar. Right beside my vehicle in the driveway were what appeared to be footprints trailing through the snow. Initially, I thought my girlfriend must have woken up before me and stepped outside for some reason. But as I examined the area more closely, I realized that couldn't be true. The footprints led across my front yard and through a gap in our side yard fence, indicating they had come from the woods. Furthermore, the trail didn't head toward our house at all, which ruled out the possibility of my girlfriend being the source. I stood there utterly bewildered. The tracks didn't circle around our house or approach any windows. They went straight to the driver's side door of my truck. This suggested that someone had walked directly from the woods to my vehicle, only to turn around and head back into the forest. It was truly strange. Later that day, I brought it up with my girlfriend, but she clearly had nothing to do with it. I wish I could provide more specifics about that initial incident, but it happened so long ago that this is about all I can recall. It must have been at least 2 winters later before anything else occurred. I distinctly recall it was 2015, the year my Seahawks faced off against Tom Brady in the Super Bowl and unfortunately lost. That morning I got up and headed to my car. I believe it was a weekday, although I can't say for certain. The moment I stepped outside, I sensed that something was seriously amiss. There were footprints all over the place. I'm talking about the driveway near every window and all around the house's perimeter. The entire yard was blanketed with them. I'm generally a calm person, so I won't claim that I panicked, but I definitely wasn't entirely at ease either. Since I was already running late for work, I didn't have the luxury of examining the prints too closely, but I felt uneasy leaving my girlfriend in what could be a risky situation. I hurriedly circled the house and yard to check for any potential intruders, but that was about all I could manage given my time constraints. As I was driving out of the driveway, I shot my girlfriend a text to inform her of the situation, hoping to keep her from worrying too much. I ended up leaving work early that day because I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling from my mind. When I finally returned home, my girlfriend had made some startling observations. As soon as I arrived, she waved me over to the yard and pointed at one of the trails, mentioning it had been bothering her throughout the day. At first I was puzzled, but then it clicked. None of the footprints had any shoe impressions. I felt foolish for not noticing it sooner. Whoever had made those prints had been walking around barefoot. I was completely speechless. Who would walk around without shoes in such cold weather? My girlfriend speculated that it might have been some kind of animal, but the tracks genuinely resembled 2 human feet. We went inside and called my dad, but he told us he had never encountered anything like that during his years living in that house. He instructed me to pick up my rifle and attempt to track down the individual who had left the footprints. I was reluctant to do so, but I understood that it was my duty. My girlfriend suggested we call the police, but I felt that would be futile. We lacked any proof of a crime having taken place, and I doubted that mere trespassing would justify a police search. I assured her that I would contact the authorities if I discovered anything unusual in the woods, and she agreed with my plan. As I mentioned earlier, those woods have a life of their own, so I promised myself I would head back as soon as dusk began to settle. With my rifle slung over my shoulder, I set off into the woods. After about 30 minutes of following the trail, I stumbled upon something quite peculiar. Out of nowhere, the path forked into 2 separate directions. I was uncertain which path to take. In fact, I didn't even realize that could happen. I considered the possibility that the person who made the trail had circled back to throw me off. But then a more unsettling thought crossed my mind. What if there were multiple individuals out there? I had been under the impression that I was tracking just one person all along. The idea of encountering more than one person had never crossed my mind before, and it was enough to rattle me. The thought of being potentially outnumbered in the woods made me uneasy. I lingered for a moment longer before deciding to turn back, especially since it was getting dark. As I retraced my steps, my mind kept returning to those footprints. I couldn't shake the feeling that I would have noticed if 2 people were trying to walk in the same tracks. There's no way the person behind could have done so without making at least one mistake. Then I wondered if someone had walked backward from deeper within the woods to create the illusion of two people being present all along. Of course, there was also the chance that it was just one person who had doubled back on themselves. Perhaps someone had been carrying another individual on their back and simply grew weary. I honestly couldn't decide which explanation was more unsettling. That night, we did end up contacting the police, but as I had anticipated, they informed us that without solid proof of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. I mentioned to my girlfriend that I'd venture into the woods again the following morning, but heavy snowfall overnight erased any tracks we could have followed. My girlfriend was understandably frightened, yet there was absolutely nothing we could do about it. Fortunately, that incident turned out to be the last of its kind for that winter. In fact, we experienced a few years of peace after that. I would even say that we had managed to put the entire ordeal behind us. A lot transpired during that time. My girlfriend and I got engaged, and our focus shifted to other aspects of our lives. However, I wouldn't be sharing this if the story concluded there. What I'm about to recount took place less than a year ago, specifically in January, right after the new year. One ordinary morning, I awoke to find footprints scattered all over my property. Instantly, all those memories rushed back to me. My fiancée broke down in our bedroom, questioning whether we had truly escaped this nightmare. I was at a loss for words. This time it felt even worse. There were footprints leading directly to my shed, and several tools were missing. Who knows what else those intruders might have done? I was infuriated. I reached out to my friend Theo, explained the situation, and asked if he could assist me. Theo is quite the outdoorsman, and has far more hunting experience than I do, which is why I sought his help. He agreed and made his way to my house a few hours later. My fiancée was extremely anxious, but I reassured her that Theo and I would manage just fine. We dressed warmly and prepared ourselves, aware that we might be out there for an extended period. The reason I felt less apprehensive about the darkness this time was that Theo owned a high-end thermal scope for his AR-10, which would enable us to see in low-light conditions. I had never invested that much in hunting gear, so I would still be at a disadvantage, but it was certainly reassuring to know that at least one of us would have visibility. I won't beat around the bush. I was genuinely frightened as we set out. Initially, Theo and I chatted while walking, but after about 45 minutes our conversation dwindled to silence. It felt like the gravity of our situation dawned on us simultaneously. I distinctly remember praying that I hadn't led Theo into a terrible predicament. I'm not sure how long we continued, but eventually, we came across another fork in the tracks. We chose the left path for a few minutes, but then it just ended without warning. We backtracked to the fork, and Theo remarked that whoever had made those tracks clearly didn't want to be followed. I wasn't keen on dwelling on that thought, so we silently continued to follow the footprints. I kid you not, we encountered at least 3 other dead ends that forced us to turn back, which wasted precious daylight. I found it astonishing that someone could walk backwards so skillfully that their footprints didn't appear to have been disturbed multiple times. Honestly, it felt off. The silver lining, as Theo pointed out, was that these dead ends likely indicated we were only tracking one person. Eventually, darkness began to settle in. By that time, we were deep in the woods, and everything looked unfamiliar to me. The trail of footprints remained consistent for quite a while after that. Theo suggested that whoever we were following had probably stopped trying to create dead ends. After about 5 more minutes, we noticed the footprints becoming significantly deeper. We were closing in. Suddenly, another set of footprints appeared right next to the original ones. Theo swore under his breath, realizing he had misjudged the situation. and now it seemed we were tracking two individuals. The sun had nearly disappeared by this point, so Theo was frequently checking his scope. The snow provided some visibility, but honestly, I might have turned back if it weren't for Theo's scope. We moved forward in complete silence. Then, out of nowhere, I felt Theo's arm press against my chest, signaling me to halt. I glanced over at him, and he was intently focused ahead, peering through his scope. I couldn't make out what had captured his attention, so I continued to watch him instead. It seemed like he was holding his breath. I had never seen him so motionless. After what felt like a long 20 seconds, he gradually moved toward the nearest tree and crouched down. Without questioning it, I mimicked his actions. He looked through his scope once more, and I noticed his hand starting to shake slightly. Another 20 seconds passed in utter silence. The suspense was killing me, so I gently tapped his shoulder. He lowered his rifle and silently passed it to me. I peered through the scope and had to stifle a scream. There were 4 figures huddled in the snow. Initially, I thought they might be bears, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. They were people. 2 of them were large and hunched over, while the other 2 appeared smaller. The smaller ones were clinging to a nearby tree, their heads darting around erratically. They were consuming something. Although I couldn't see their faces or any details, thermal scopes don't provide that kind of clarity. I could tell they were completely naked. It was the most horrifying sight I had ever witnessed. Eventually, the larger figures lifted the smaller ones from the tree and placed them on their shoulders. They then began to move deeper into the woods. Theo and I remained hidden under that tree for what felt like an eternity. We didn't dare make a sound until we were absolutely certain those creatures couldn't hear us. When we finally returned to the house hours later, I was surprised to find my fiancée still awake. She told me she couldn't sleep knowing I was out there and asked what we had discovered. I shared the details as sparingly as I could, but she was still left shaken. That night we contacted the police, who assured us they would search the woods first thing in the morning. Theo decided to stay over so we could help the authorities with their search efforts. The following morning, the police began searching the woods with our assistance, but they called it off after a few hours because the footprints were partially obscured. My fiancé insisted that they continue the search, but they explained that they couldn't justify a large-scale operation over some missing tools. While I understand their reasoning, it still left me feeling unsettled. Theo and I are certain about what we witnessed. With winter approaching quickly, both my fiancé and I are anxious that those individuals might return. We're seriously contemplating relocating, but we haven't made any progress on that front yet. I'm feeling quite confused about everything. As I mentioned before, I've shared our experiences with anyone who would listen. This has been an ongoing issue for years now. None of my neighbors have faced anything similar, which is puzzling to me. I can't figure out why my home seems to be a target or what those people actually want. Some friends believe they're harmless, while others warn me that I'm in serious danger. I think I'm going to attempt to block off my yard from the woods, but beyond that, I'm not sure what else to do. Hopefully, we can move soon. Last summer, I decided to take on a significant stretch of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always had a passion for hiking, particularly solo adventures. My plan was straightforward. Leave my car at the end of the section, catch a ride to the trailhead, and then hike back over the course of a little more than a week and a half. At the time, it seemed like a simple enough plan. The first few days went as expected, with the trail living up to my hopes. Endless stretches of towering trees and winding paths through peaceful landscapes. I'm in decent shape, so I don't need to take frequent breaks while hiking. However, I obviously wouldn't hike after dark, so each night I needed to set up a tent to get some rest. I've always preferred to stay under the radar, especially since solo hikers can draw unwanted attention. Because of this, I decided to venture slightly off the beaten path each night to set up my camp. I thought it would be safer that way, reducing the likelihood of an unexpected visitor finding my campsite. Everything went smoothly until the third night, but what I'm about to share is why I've chosen to take a long break from hiking and any kind of outdoor adventure. In the middle of the night, I woke up with an unsettling feeling that something was amiss. It was that inexplicable gut instinct you just can't shake off, and I knew better than to dismiss it. I scanned the inside of my tent. Everything appeared normal, so I opted to step outside and check the campsite. I grabbed my rifle, took a flashlight, and unzipped the tent. To my relief, there was no one in sight. After returning to my tent, I began rummaging through my pack. That's when I discovered my wallet was missing. Initially, I thought I might have misplaced it, perhaps left it outside or buried somewhere in my gear. But after searching thoroughly, it became evident that someone had taken it. All my personal information, cash, credit cards, gone. How could this happen? Had someone really sneaked into my tent just to swipe that one item? It seemed improbable, yet misplacing it felt completely out of character for me. I reluctantly accepted the unfortunate reality that I must have lost it myself. But things only escalated from there. In the following days, I noticed even more items were missing. Small, seemingly random things. One of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. They were all gone. I knew I wasn't just misplacing everything. Someone was definitely stealing my stuff. A part of me wanted to deny it, but by the fourth day, the truth was undeniable. I was being followed. With no cell service in that area of the trail, I couldn't reach out for help regarding my predicament. I remember considering turning back, but I realized that would only save me a couple of days at most. There was no way I could hike in either direction without getting some sleep, but the thought of setting up a tent in those woods with someone stalking me made me uneasy. It felt like a no-win scenario. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that there was a reason I had my rifle with me. Then it hit me. Why hadn't that person taken my gun? It seemed like they were intentionally toying with me. That night I secured my tent from the inside, hoping it would keep them out if they decided to come back. I tried to stay awake for as long as I could, but eventually exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. Fortunately, my strategy paid off because when I woke up the next morning, there were no signs of anyone having entered my tent. However, by then, paranoia had completely taken hold of me. The isolation was messing with my mind, and every moment spent hiking felt like torture. I've never experienced anxiety before, but I can honestly say I've never felt worse than I did during those next few days. Just picture being in my shoes, forced to keep hiking while knowing someone was lurking nearby. The anxiety was relentless, and I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. I can't quite explain it, but my mind began to play tricks on me. A rustling sound in the bushes turned out to be nothing significant. A fleeting shadow at the corner of my eye disappeared the instant I turned to look. The hallucinations intensified. I can't recall most of them in detail, but one particularly stands out. While walking, I suddenly felt as though I stepped into an ankle-deep puddle that nearly made me stumble. I distinctly heard the splash and felt the cold water soaking my sock, but when I glanced down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there in disbelief. It felt so incredibly real. With no other option, I pressed on down the trail. As tough as the days were, the nights proved to be even more challenging. I secured my tent and slept beside my rifle, yet nothing eased my anxiety. At one point, I even splashed cold water on my face in an attempt to calm myself down. The hallucinations mostly faded after that experience. I can only imagine how I would have reacted if they had persisted. The following night, I was jolted, awake by the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I quietly reached for my rifle, ready to face whoever was there, but fear had me paralyzed. Eventually, the sounds drifted away into the woods, yet there was no way I could sleep after that. As soon as dawn broke, I hurriedly packed up my camp, my hands trembling so much that tying my gear felt nearly impossible. I couldn't bear to spend another night out there. I was so close, probably just a day and a quarter's hike from my car, maybe even less if I hurried. I made up my mind not to stop for sleep that night. I would push through until I escaped that dreadful trail. I trekked for hours, moving as fast as my body would allow. When the sun began to set, I gritted my teeth and pressed on instead of stopping to set up my tent. By the time it was completely dark, I was incredibly close, likely just 2 hours away at most. I kept walking, flashlight in one hand and rifle in the other. Doubts about my decision started creeping in. I had never hiked in the dark before, and I was unprepared for the challenges it presented. That alone was frightening enough. I pressed on, trying to maintain steady breaths. About an hour later, as I drew nearer, I heard something. Somewhere behind me, I was convinced I heard footsteps. I quickly turned around and shone my light, only to be horrified when I saw something slip behind a tree. Adrenaline surged through me, and I aimed my rifle at the tree. I shouted loudly, demanding that whatever it was come out. The figure stepped into view. It was unmistakably human, but I assure you it was the most savage-looking creature I had ever encountered. Words fail to capture what I was witnessing. He was clad in nothing but a pair of my shorts, which I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin bore numerous scratches, and his face was obscured by hair. He began to approach me even though I had my rifle pointed directly at him. Acting on instinct, I fired a warning shot beside him. The loud noise startled him, and he quickly dashed back into the forest. I was left in disbelief. Without hesitating, I turned around and hurried away. Once I emerged from the woods, I locked my car doors and called the authorities. When the police finally arrived, they advised me to leave the area. I didn't need any further encouragement. I was gone that very night. What struck me as the most bizarre aspect of the entire ordeal were the hallucinations. I never imagined they could be so intense. It will take a long time before I feel ready to hike again, and I can assure you that next time, I won't be going solo. I would strongly recommend anyone considering a hike on the Pacific Crest Trail to exercise extreme caution and carry a firearm. This experience is one that lingers in my mind frequently. I apologize in advance if I misremember any details of the story I'm about to share. This is something my best friend recounted to me numerous times several years ago. It's one of those unsettling tales that sticks with you, no matter how many times you hear it. My friend's father worked as a logger, specifically operating a tree saw. For those unfamiliar, a tree saw is an enormous machine designed to fell massive trees and cut them to precise lengths. His job involved long, arduous hours, often spent alone in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. Due to the way his logging crew operated, he was compensated based on the number of trees he cut rather than the hours he put in, which led him to frequently work 16 20-hour days to complete jobs swiftly. After he and his colleague wrapped up their tasks, the rest of the team would come in to clear the downed trees and haul them to the mill. While he spent about half of his time working, solo, the other half was alongside his friend Griffin, another tree saw operator. They relied on radios for communication, especially when working on opposite sides of the same site. Several years back, my friend's father and Griffin were sent to a secluded job site located high in the mountains. The company spent more than 3 weeks just clearing a path wide enough for their trucks and equipment to reach the location. By the time they finally started working, they found themselves in an incredibly isolated area of the mountain. After 10 days of solid progress, they began to pick up odd chatter on their radios. Initially, the voices were muffled, mere faint whispers mixed with static that made no sense. They attempted to change channels, but no matter what they tried, the strange chatter persisted. Anyone familiar with standard radios knows how bizarre this is. It should be impossible for anyone to track you while switching frequencies. As they climbed higher up the mountain, the voices grew clearer. While they couldn't catch entire conversations, they both sensed that the tone of the snippets felt unsettling. My friend's dad remarked that at times it sounded almost casual, yet the actual content was incomprehensible. They also started stumbling upon peculiar signs, indicating that others had been there before them. They discovered random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small makeshift campsites. As I mentioned earlier, they were in such a remote location that it seemed nearly unreachable, making these findings quite alarming. It was clear that no one should have been up there. One day, Griffin stumbled upon a tent concealed just off a trail and called my friend's dad over to take a look. They decided to check it out. Inside, they found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with incredibly disturbing items. There were several pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude drawings depicting children being harmed. They even found photos of a fresh apple, suggesting that whoever owned it had been there very recently. Griffin was eager to pack up and leave right away. However, my friend's dad, who was always focused on work, insisted they complete the job. They agreed to restrict radio communication to emergencies only, and chose to continue their work. That night, they sat in the camper, unable to shake off the ominous feeling that loomed over them. The radio crackled back to life, and this time, they could hear fragments of a conversation between two men. They were discussing ordinary tasks, like collecting water and firewood. But the unsettling thought that these men might be linked to the tent sent my friend's dad into a panic. While Griffin remained relatively calm, my friend's dad was clearly losing his composure. The following night, my friend's dad resolved to confront them. Upon overhearing the men talk about gathering brush for a fire, he seized the radio and demanded to know their identities and intentions. The radio fell silent at once, and the men offered no reply. That eerie silence felt even more disconcerting than the previous chatter. Griffin was frustrated that my friend's dad had revealed their presence, leading to a brief argument before they agreed to take further action the next day. Around midnight, Griffin shook my friend's dad awake, urgently, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first thing he heard was the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. His heart raced as he scrambled for his gun, only to discover it was unloaded. He had no clue where his ammunition was stashed. Griffin was also unarmed, and the idea of calling the police seemed ridiculous given their remote location. They both sat in frozen silence as they heard the camper door handle rattle. The door creaked open slightly, but didn't fully swing inward. Their camper was elevated off the ground with no ladder or stool available for climbing up. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scratches along the exterior of the door. 4 agonizing minutes ticked by. At last, my friend's dad nodded at Griffin, indicating he was going to investigate. He stealthily approached the door, gripping a flashlight with trembling hands. Just as he reached the door, it swung open violently, and he was struck across the face with a knife. The pain was overwhelming, causing him to tumble out of the camper and hit the ground hard. Before he could regain his footing, a man was on top of him, pressing the knife against his neck. Another man appeared, delivering repeated kicks to his head. Without a moment's hesitation, Griffin jumped out of the camper and tackled the man wielding the knife. The second man dashed into the shadows, while the one Griffin had tackled quickly got back on his feet and took off after him. They vanished into the woods. Griffin assisted my dad's friend back into the truck, and they drove for 2 hours to reach the nearest hospital. It was serious. His face was a gruesome sight, with a deep cut across his eye that left him with lasting vision impairment. They informed the police about the assault, but no action was taken. 2 weeks later, as the logging crew wrapped up their work, one of their colleagues was discovered bound, gagged, assaulted, and murdered in a ditch. There were no arrests made in connection with the case. Even now, my friend's dad continues to battle PTSD. His right eye, marked by a distorted pupil, serves as a constant reminder of that horrific night. I doubt he has enjoyed a full night of peaceful sleep since then. I've harbored a fear of dense forests for quite some time, largely due to what happened to my friend's dad. I haven't been in touch with my friend or his father for years, so I can only wish that they are doing okay.